internet bookworms, welcome to another episode of Pages and Pages. This week we're going to talk about Margaret Atwood's Alias Grace. And because this is a denser piece of literature, we're going to do it in a bit different way than we've done it before. Instead of doing broad sweeping overviews of things I liked about it, I thought that we could delve into it a bit more and talk about what is really at the heart of the story. So, let's begin. Margaret Atwood is known for strong feminist themes and also wrote the really well-known book called A Handmaid's Tale, which I've also read and is a really cool way to do a dystopian future book by giving it a twist with the past. You know how I like time collisions. Alias Grace is historical fiction based on a real-life murder case that happened at the turn of the century up in Canada, revolving around a 16-year-old girl named Grace Marks. Now, in the real history, they never found out if Grace Marks was really guilty or innocent, but she did spend about 30 years of her life in prison and then moved to America, or was released and moved to America and disappeared eventually. So, that's the real history. There's a lot of gaps and a lot of speculation and sensationalism that it revolves around the case because it was so dramatic with the murder and the sexual intrigue and all of that. So a lot of the newspapers back then, historically, were very sensationally driven. So they were just out to tell a good story and not necessarily tell the facts, which is interesting considering that one of the major themes in here is honesty and dishonesty and what defines those and where do true stories come from, or what is a true story. Especially when you're talking about characters, is one person's perspective the real thing, or is it because it's an individual's perspective, there's going to be a bias and there's going to be a lie in it somehow. So that's a thing that gets really explored in this text. I love the format of this book because in true Margaret Atwood style, there are the long passages of first-person narrative that give it a really, you can really get inside the character's skin that way. Also, though, she included a bunch of real newspaper clippings in the newspaper articles. She also included letters that are fictional between characters and some poetry that was written during the time. And she really did her research. You get a really clear picture of what was the climate of the time, what was happening in especially the field of psychology and that sort of thing during this time. So that's another major theme that's in this book is mental health, actually, and what the origins of psychology and insane asylums and that sort of thing are rather horrific, and at this time they were starting to kind of see that, maybe, and starting to change things around and actually starting to make it a science. But in that, there's a lot of things that you're like, oh man, this is not great science, and back to that whole sensationalism thing. If you can tell a convincing story, then you get away with it. Because this book is a murder mystery, it reads a lot like an episode of a crime show where they're trying to sort out what really happened. So I can really see this being a movie, and I think there's even a Canadian lady director who a couple years ago said she was going to make a movie, but I couldn't find anything about an actual film, which is disappointing. So in addition to those themes, there's some really good symbolism in here. She draws out the symbolism of a quilt. Of course, the main character, Grace, is a seamstress, or not a seamstress, but she sews a lot. I guess that's a seamstress, right? I don't know. So, 1800s, right as sewing machines were starting to become a thing. So, it's a lot of hand sewing, and so she's sitting there sewing and telling her story to this psychologist, doctor person character. She's like literally stitching together a quilt while she's stitching together a story, so you get that symbolism there. Additionally, the quilt patterns she refers to are often puzzle-like or, again, like symbolism. So there's one called the Tree of Paradise that features strongly And of course, the tree of paradise refers to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil from the Bible. It's biblical imagery in a Puritan setting, who would have thought? But anyways, there's a lot of biblical imagery in here as well, from, you know, the classic apple to, like I just said with the quilts, the tree of paradise. Having biblical themes in this book is really interesting because it is overlaid onto a murder case, and you're not sure if the main character is guilty or not. You would think that having those biblical themes would imply a guilt or a grace that can then be lived out in the character. So I wanted to read a passage because I think it sums up how those biblical themes were incorporated into the quilting symbolism and the murder case. It comes from towards the end, so hopefully I don't give too much away. The pattern of this quilt is called Tree of Paradise, and whoever named that pattern said better than she knew, as the Bible does not say trees. It says there were two different trees, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. But I believe there was only one, and that the fruit of life and the fruit of good and evil were the same. And if you ate of it, you would die. But if you didn't eat of it, you would die also. Although if you did eat of it, you would be less bone ignorant by the time you got around to your death. Such an arrangement would appear to be more the way life is. I'm telling this to no one but you, as I am aware it is not the approved reading. So hopefully that doesn't give away the ending too much, but in that quote you kind of see that the main character has really thought through what was involved with the fall of man and what guilt was involved there, and has come to the conclusion that things are a lot more gray, because that's how she sees her world, considering that there are those strong, such a strong religious climate at this time. So that's really an interesting aspect of this book. Which brings me to the main question I think this book asks, as history also asks it. We want to know whether or not Grace Marks is guilty, or, as her namesake implies, she deserves grace and is innocent. So that's kind of an interesting main question. There's a lot wrapped up into that: justice and individual perspective and story and bias and storytelling. Also, as the doctor is trying to determine this about her in the book, you're having kind of an interesting moral conflict within him as well, and so you kind of get a lot of questions about how you can judge other people and what you can judge people on. And I think that the answer this book comes to is that, well, I don't know, maybe you should just read it and we can talk about it below, because I think an argument can be made either way. Usually like historical fiction, but this was a really excellent book. Again, Margaret Atwood is a fantastic writer. So hopefully some of those crazy jumble of thoughts made sense to you. This is Alias Grace. I really enjoyed it, and thank you for watching. See you next time.